Anything before we move forward? I just wanted to check if there's anything, any questions, little aha moments, or just simply observations that you wanted to make before we move forward. Yeah.
It was one of my colleagues has reminded me something that I did want to make sure that I shared, which was avoiding the punch in the face moment. So in getting this and understanding it more and seeing it working for me and for others, is, it's just so obvious. And yet, with people with certain challenges or things that have been going on for a while, it's to avoid the punch in the face when you tell them how it's just how it is in the nature of things. So I don't think I have a question on the end of it, but curious about how do we share this with people, and how do I make sure that I'm doing it in an eloquent way that avoids a black eye, but continues to...
Yeah, I mean, I realized at one point, I don't know if you've seen the emoticon, which is hides behind sofa. So it's like this, you type something a little controversial on a forum, and then this little cartoon character says it and ducks down and hides behind the sofa. There's two things that occur to me that might just be useful as an immediate address. One is the difference between being on a roll and being in flow. Often as trainers, we get on a roll. Like people are with us, and the ideas are just coming, and we're on a roll, and we just talk and we stop noticing what's going on the other side of the loop. And it's usually when we get on a roll that we inadvertently kick somebody in the nuts. That would get us the punch in the face. It doesn't come out of nowhere most of the time. It comes because we stopped looking. And we usually stop looking. Sometimes it's because we get up in our heads with worry, but actually often it's because we get up in our heads because it's going well. So that's one thing that I found a useful distinction around it. The other is, you gotta understand, you're fucking with people's egos. You're fucking with the fundamental building blocks of their realities. And in the same way as I hope if you were like, it always makes me laugh in James Bond movies when he removes the nuclear isotope. With like, ooh, okay, like, no, I mean, I'd like a little more care and procedure around that, please. Right? Well, it's the same thing. We can treat it lightly because it's conversational, but you really are you're poking around in the fabric of somebody's reality. And if you recognize that that's what you're doing, you'll do it with a lot more respect. And I don't mean respect for the person in an intellectual way. I mean respect for what you're messing with. This is, at one level we can say, oh, it's all an illusion, get over it. But that's why we have black eyes, because we say it like that. So there's a part of the process that I don't, it's funny, I've been talking about it this trip. I don't remember ever having talked about it before. But it's what it feels like to me that is often an important part of working with people that leads to breakthrough. And I call it poking the bear. Because you're essentially kind of poking at that ego construct. You're poking at that thinking, knowing that it's a bear. And when you poke a bear, one of the things the bear might do is swipe at you. And it's your fault. Or you could say it's not your fault. It's like, who are do you guys know the comedian Chris Rock? He's a very funny kind of African-American street comedian, and he was talking about Siegfried and Roy, who do the show in Vegas with the Tigers. And, one of them, let's say it was Siegfried, I don't remember, got mauled by one of the tigers in the show. And everyone went, oh man, that tiger just went crazy. And Chris Rock went, the tiger didn't go crazy. The tiger went tiger. Right? Well, that's it, right? That's one of the natural responses that would happen if you poke a bear is it's going to poke back. And if you know that, you develop a sensitivity to bear poking. You recognize it's an important part of the process sometimes, but you also do it with the caution that poking a bear merits. When you've done When you've poked a few thousand bears, you get a facility with it. And so you can look like you're not paying attention, but if you really stop paying attention, you will get mauled. And you should, because you poked a bear. Does that make sense? Yeah, great. Thanks. Can we get the mic forward?
I had a question about change. So I guess working increasingly with change in teams and with larger systems. And you gave the example of smoking before, and it seems to me that a large part of the change there was social change and a change in social norms, which then, as I suppose, that was the cause. The effect was that it changed individual behaviour. And I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. Are we talking about kind of group hardware and group programs here, and individual, or just individual?
So the way that I would map that over to that question, if I understand it, and if I didn't, tell me.
I don't think I understood it myself, but
well,
thanks for feeding
well then fine, I can say anything. This is great. Well, you see, in World War II, no, so the BIOS is, every individual has that. There are group operating systems. So if you think about a system like the Enneagram, how many of you are familiar with the Enneagram? Right, there's the 9 different operating systems for humans, right? Countries have operating systems, right? There are countries who very much fit the Enneagram styles. But that's at the level of program, operating system, that. Now, when somebody, and I don't understand this bit, and maybe there's a reason in the brain for it, but I see it all the time. For some reason, when somebody sees their own built-in operating system, when they see what's actually creating their experience, it impacts the experience. It literally changes the way the system runs. It settles it down. It seems to run more smoothly after than before. And in a group, what it does is it both helps people step outside of that cultural operating system, which then gives us a chance to actually observe it, and gives them a chance to make changes that might not fit the larger program, but that still can work within it. Which is why the best teams, the teams who get this at the deepest level in my experience, go one of two ways. Either they become renegade, and like they just have their own rules in the companies because they're always the most effective groups, let them, and gradually they gather more people to them and more people to them and more people to them and become like a, this thing. Or they find a way of operating inside the culture as part of the insight that they get. So even though they see, this is not the way this world is set up, whether it's a corporate program or it's a national program or whatever it is, I can navigate it really effectively anyways. And that's why sometimes you get the Catholic priests who really see something way beyond what the church dogma, but can still work well within the church. That's why you get the rabbis. Like the last time I was here was Shel Rosenblatt, who runs Tikkun. And I said to him, I do not understand how you can be an Orthodox rabbi and teach principles. Because to me at that time, it seemed like so incompatible. And he explained it to me. He actually had an answer that made total sense to me. He said, the thing is, he said, as it happens, I believe that everything in the Bible is true. He said, I think there were stone tablets, and I think there was an ark. And he says, I just do. He says, but my role, and we're going to be talking about what our role as a facilitator is as we move forward. He said, my role is to awaken people to their souls. He said, if I can do that through my tradition, that's my favorite way. He said, but I've noticed that when I share these principles with people, they seem to just get it. And so I teach principles. And there's something about, we assume it's got to be a conflict because it's like, well, everyone else thinks it's this and I think it's this. And sometimes it can be, but actually, that's just something over here. It's like, well, given that I'm operating inside a system that totally doesn't think this way, how do I navigate that? Well, great. I start tuning into mind, I start getting insights, and I find a way to do that too. That addresses what I thought you were asking.
Yeah, that's useful.
Okay.
I think I'm not quite there.
Okay, great. Beautiful. And that's what this is. This is just a space to bring stuff up. Anything else before we move forward that just is arising and feels worth exploring?
I'm curious how, as the bios and as people start to see that, how it changes what happens in the skill development box, and how there's a kind of interplay between the two, because that's where people nearly always start.
Yeah.
And having an awareness of how those two interplay, I think, is an area to explore.
Yeah, it's cool. I got to just on. I don't know what country I'm in. I don't know what day it is. On Sunday, I was co-presenting with Anders Haglund in Sweden, and he works primarily with athletes, and was a European golf champion way back when. And one of the things that he was talking about in terms of it is just people getting out of their own way more and more and more. So when they practice, they don't practice to feel better. They practice to do better. And so much of practice in skill development is about feeling better about yourself. And that totally creates a different environment, different feedback system, and different results. So that's just a very simple distinction, but I heard that one. Yeah, I know that one. It's like I had a personal trainer once. My wife is a personal trainer now, and I had a trainer who said, whenever my eyes were getting too big for my biceps, he said, work your muscles, not your ego. Same idea. With skill development, there is an outcome we are trying to get to. And when my opinion about it and what I think of me in relation to it becomes relevant, it interferes with the process. So yeah, cool. Take one more if it's out there. So I thought what might be useful would be to share what I personally, so this is now me, Michael, right? I'm now not teaching principles in this moment. I am teaching how I work with principles. But I want to use that as a context for sharing principles. What I consider to be the desired outcomes of my work with groups or with people. Like, this is what I'm looking for. This is how I measure how it's going. It's not actually the only way I measure how it's going. I'll get into that a little bit more. But this is, at an outcome level, this is what I'm going for. And there's 4 things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of talk through the 4 things, talk a little bit about them, and we'll see where we're at with that, and then we'll pick up this afternoon and go into more detail. But the first one, say it. I'm going to say this the way it is in my head, and then we can translate, okay? Awaken the divine spark, ignite the divine spark, and fan the flames. So there is a part of us, and this is the bit where you start, either sounding kind of stupid or religious or something. But there is a part of every human being I have ever met that is beyond their personality. It's the part that you kind of imagine that if they'd grown up, if they'd been switched at birth and grown up in a different family, in a different country, that would still be there, that part. It's the essence of them. And one of the qualities of that part of people is that it seems to be part of a larger whole. It seems to be in tune with something beyond itself. So I sometimes, many of you will have seen, I sometimes draw the diamond. And at our essence, the diamond of our essence, in the principles, we'll often talk about this as somebody's innate health, their innate wisdom, their innate well-being. But it is, one of the most enjoyable sessions I ever did with somebody. To this day, I couldn't tell you what happened. Right? We were teaching a course called Financially Fearless. This was in 2010. And we gave them an assignment, the group. Over lunch, they had an hour and a half to go out and make money. We had talked about how people make money. And when they got back from the break, they were going to have to write up on the board how much they made. That was it. That was the assignment. The group, by the way, 18 people made $84,000 over lunch. And I was like, I should do this for a living. But this one woman came up to me in the break and was not happy. And there's always going to be, of course, if you're giving people, you're poking the bear. You're telling people, hey, just go do something that they have so much thinking about that it doesn't feel like a just go do. And, she was just sitting there, I remember, in front of me, like head in hands. And it was interesting because I was aware in that moment that it seemed to me like the most useful thing I could do was sit there and listen. Like nothing came to me, but it didn't seem like something should. And so she sat there and she kind of talked about why she couldn't do it. She was an academic. She was a PhD in this. She was, that wasn't her training. That wasn't her background. That wasn't this. That wasn't that. And then she got quiet. And you've probably noticed, if you've been in the principles for any length of time, that when people settle down, they start to do well. Well, she settled down. She talked herself out, is kind of how it looked to me. And it got quiet. She still had her head down. And I swear to God, she looked up, and it was like somebody had lit a fire behind her eyes. I mean, that look of total inspiration, and then she said, not what I expected. She said, I can sing Gershwin songs. Nothing in the monologue that had preceded that moment would indicate that this academic PhD with no financial background thought singing Gershwin songs for money would be fun. But you know what? She went out and she made $29, $30 because I gave her one at the buck at the end because I just thought, well, that was awesome. And she just went up to strangers in Arizona, like in this resort that we were at, and said, can I sing for you? And then just started. And a bunch of them gave her money. And the reason I tell that story is because that light has never gone out. That was in 2010. I've known this woman since then. She's so lit up that it's like, it's extraordinary to me. Well, it's that. She found that. It wasn't singing Gershwin songs, or else it would have only lasted for that moment. She touched this. She touched her innate health. The divine spark ignited, and the rest of the conversation that we had from then on was just about fanning the flames. Now, there is no formula I have found that automatically will ignite everybody's spark, and it's one of the reasons that I tend to do 3 days at the beginning of a client intake, because I've just never had somebody go 3 days and not wake up to it. But honestly, I mean, we're down to 2.5. The last 5 or 6 I've done have been done, clearly done. But I don't know, other than creating an environment where we're settled down and we're looking towards this. We're looking in this direction. And people see it. And I have to assume that people see it because it's actually there. Because if it was only seeing it because I was doing such a great job of painting it, then it wouldn't be there when I stopped painting it. They get a feel for it. They get a feel for what that place inside them is like. My son, it's interesting because I never purposely talked to my kids about this. My son, when he was 17, I realized that he picked some of it up by proxy. Because he said to me, we were playing ping pong, that's where all the great conversations in my house happen, over the ping pong table. And we were playing ping pong, and he said to me, he said, you know, everybody else at school is really freaked out about finals and getting into university. He said, I'm just not. And I said, why not? And he said, well, I think it's because of you. Now, obviously, my ears pricked up. Right? This sounds good. But we never talked about it, so I also kind of didn't know what. And he said, well, the thing is, I see you do what you do, and you just don't get freaked out. You get pissed off, but you know, but then it comes back. And I just think, well, if you can deal with life like that, why would I get freaked out about school? Now, that was interesting to me. Like, we never talked about that. That was something he saw. He came back the first summer. Now, at that point, he got interested in what I did. And so I shared some of the books that I liked and showed him some videos. And he came along. He came to my TED Talk. He came along on some of the events that we were running. And again, I got this glimpse that he'd seen something more. Because he said to me in the afternoon, he said, I said, what are you doing tonight? He said, oh, there's a big party, but I'm not going. I said, why not? He said, well, I've kind of been seeing these two girls, and they're both going to be at the party, and they both think I'm just seeing them, and I just, you know. And I'm like, okay. And then about 4 hours later, I see him heading out. I'm like, where are you off to? He said, oh, I'm going to the party. I go, I thought you weren't going to go because the girls. And he goes, oh, I figure future Oliver will figure that one out. And I was like, cool, right? He's seen something about the well. He knows that in the moment, it's actually easier to come up with solutions than it is when you try and think them through. You know, human beings are really good at eating what's on our plate. We're not very good at eating what was on our plate yesterday or what's going to be on our plate tomorrow. But if it's on our plate now, we can handle it, right? So then he called me this summer, and he said, I don't remember the phrase, he used a nice phrase, but essentially said, I've seen it. And he just has. Now, it took more than 3 days, but we also weren't talking about it. It's in people. There are people who are in touch with that who've never heard of the 3 principles, right? It's not that you've got to learn the principles to be in touch with that. It's just that when I knew about this, it's not personal, she promised. It's just that when we look towards it, we tend to see it more quickly, and we tend to recognize it for what it is, and we tend not to mythologize it. Because if we don't, if we just suddenly have that experience and we have no context for it, we suddenly light up, and we don't know why. We look for, well, what lit me up? Because I want more of this, and then we make up whatever the nearest thing is. Oh, you lit me up. Let's get married. You know, or, oh my God, this teacher lit me up. Let me go on more courses. Or, oh my gosh, God lit me up. Let me go into my religion. And it's all of those things are present, right? This is not against any of those things, right? You know, it's just seeing that all of them are reflections of this diamond of spirit, for lack of a better term. And there are different ways that we as human beings have learned to understand a universal experience. So one of the goals of this conversation, for me, when I do it, is this. I want people to have an experience of this and to recognize it for what it is, that it is universal, that it is eternal, not eternal as in it goes on forever, eternal as in beyond time. Because when you're in that space, it's timeless. You know, some people, you know, with their more NLP hats will go, well, it's time distortion. Well, okay, yeah, but it feels timeless. So that's one of the goals of this work. And for me, it's kind of It's the primary one because if they get that one, they'll get better at everything else. Life just gets better from that place when people are in touch with that. I was talking to a group in South Africa last year, and they were care workers, and one of their kids had drowned the day before, one of their teenagers at swimming lessons. And so there was a general mood of not good in the room, and there was a lot of, I would describe it almost as like frightened blame, secret blame, because everyone knew not to go there, but they were all going there. And so it was an interesting room to walk into. They had no context for me. They didn't have some lovely person stepping up at the beginning and going, this is the man who's helped. I was just some guy. And I sat with them and we just talked about this. We didn't talk about it in terms of any particular model. I just talked about that part of you that carries on in the face of everything that you see here, because they did a lot of work. I mean, that was the least of the, their motto was from cradle, I think it was from cradle to contract. So they wanted to be there for kids from the moment they were born till they got out into the world. And that was, so they did amazing, amazing stuff they were doing. And we just talked about it. And people shared stories and people cried, and me too, But everyone kind of knew what I was talking about. They'd seen it. They'd seen it in somebody's eyes when they were in a lot of pain, but were okay, right? They'd seen it in the aftermath of incidents like this, that even though in that moment they were all up in their heads about it, they knew that they would carry on, and not carry on sadder but wiser, because that's one of the ways that we do, we just scab over, but that actually they would be as good as new. And for me, that's just the most powerful thing. The less time I have, the more that's what I want to talk about. Now, that's me. But that's one of the things that's on offer in this conversation. Okay? Second thing. I want them to get an understanding of how life works. And what I mean by that is where their experience of life is coming from the inside out, from thought into consciousness into feeling. Because that turns out to be incredibly useful. Because if we know where our experience is coming from, then when we're having a difficult experience, we know what, if anything, to do about it, or at least where, if anywhere, to look for solutions. And if we don't understand that, we spend an inordinate amount of time and an inordinate amount of energy trying to fix what isn't broken, trying to fix the shadows instead of what's creating the shadows, or even just seeing that the shadow will shift when that thing is in a different space in relation to the light, or the light is in a different space in relation to it. So it is hugely freeing for people to begin to see the inside-out nature of our experience, that we live in the feeling of thought, not the direct experience of what's going on outside us. And it changes our relationship with the world to see that. It changes my relationship with you when I fundamentally see, oh, I'm not mad at you. I'm mad and I'm with you, but I'm not mad at you. It doesn't work that way. The system works one way. It works thought, feeling. Now, I want to make a distinction that I've come to see a lot of people who've been studying the principles haven't necessarily really made. And that's between thought and thinking. Now, this was very useful for me because I didn't really see this. This was one of the reasons why I said, well, this just sounds like, NLP plus, right? We work with people's thinking. Well, thinking is an output of thought. It is a manifestation of thought. thinking is one of the things we can do with this energy of thought, is we can think things. And so what you have is you have an ocean of thought, and you have little icebergs, which are the thinking that you notice. And you go, oh, I can work on this iceberg, and I can make this iceberg almost completely disappear. But you're missing the fact that you're in the ocean. You're in the same ocean that that iceberg came up out of. And that's why when another iceberg pops up, you go, oh, I've got to work on that one too. Right? And we can work on our thinking forever. Anyone notice this? Right? Well, that's because thinking is just what happens when you swim in an ocean of thought. And all that ever happens is it changes form. It transforms back into its source, thought, this raw material with which we think. And then we've got new thinking. And some thinking is more useful at times than other thinking. Right? Is that a contentious statement for anyone? But that's what new thinking is. It's just, it went back into the formless and comes out in a new form. It goes back into the formless and comes out in a new form. It goes back into the formless, comes out in a new form. Right? That's all that's ever going on when our experience of something that isn't changing much on the outside changes a lot on the inside. Now, if I know that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time worrying about which form it's in right now. It doesn't matter, because it'll be in a different form later. And that gives me a different relationship with my own experience. I don't have to be scared of my own experience anymore. It's my favorite quote probably from Sid ever, and I put it as the sort of, there's a name for that quote you put at the beginning of a book, and it's escaping me right now. But it's just, for me, where is it? Yeah. If the only thing people learned was not to be afraid of their experience, that alone would change the world. Like, that's kind of amazing, because it actually makes us more human. It doesn't make us more robotic. Because if I don't have to be afraid of my experience, I'm free to experience it. And if I'm free to experience it, I don't have to do things to avoid experiencing it. And an extraordinary amount of what we do as human beings is designed to avoid certain experiences. And the rest is designed to create different ones. And if my experience can come and go, if I'm free to be the space in which all this experience arises, then I don't have to put any attention on that. And it gets a lot quieter up here. And I'm going to go to this in a minute, but what we've talked about already, when this settles down, I start to sense something else going on. And that's why the third thing that I'm wanting to do with people, let's see what else we've got here. Let's try blue. Oh, this one's nice too. You got to understand, I'm usually just like a black marker guy, so all these toys is great, you know. An understanding of how mind works. And what I mean by that is how the deeper mind, I drew it like this on a training last week. I'd never drawn it this way before, but I kind of liked it. I think somebody posted this picture to Facebook, actually. But it's like, that's your brain. Okay? And this isn't, again, what I'm about to say, this isn't true. This is a way of representing something that is. Okay? So your brain kind of has two modes in which it can function. It's got a sort of an output mode. And that's thinking. Right? That's my thinking. I'm thinking, I'm processing, I've got all these ideas. And it has a kind of a receptive mode, like almost like a modem, where stuff occurs to us. It comes in. It's just when our minds are settled down, when they go into this more receptive mode, we get thought that we haven't thought before. We get ideas and solutions that seem to come from somewhere else, that seem to come from certainly outside our database. Well, what we call that in the principles is we call that mind, the mind behind the brain. The brain is still the hardware. The brain is, without the brain, I don't know that anything could happen. But mind is where this sort of wisdom comes from. It's the well that gives us just what we need just when we need it. And, the less, so this is where consciousness comes into it, right? So there are times where that's all we can see. We're just in our thinking. We're in our thinking, we're in our thinking, we're in our thinking. It's so contracted, and we might even just be in one thought, like I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, I hate that, and that's our whole world. That's our experience. But the nature, bless you, the nature of consciousness is expansive. In other words, it expands and contracts, but left to its own devices, it seems to go back to full size. So the more we think, the more we think, the more we think, it can get smaller and smaller and smaller, but then when we stop, it goes back, springs back, right? So at a certain level of consciousness, well, all we can see is our thinking. And it's real. It's not thinking, right? It's real. And I'm going to punch you in the eye if you tell me it isn't, right? But then when there's a little bit less, that when we open up a little bit of space, it's like it springs out, because it's not like it's just contracted, it's being pushed in. It's trying to push back out. So the second there's even a break, it pops out. Now, one of the levels it pops out to is one where I have a sense of, the way that I'm thinking is affected. This is my thinking. This isn't. So it's subjective. Oh, okay, because I might think something different in a different situation, or somebody else might think something different in this situation. So now I've got a little bit more movement in there. There's a little bit more space. Still not necessarily much mind coming through, but there's a little bit more space for it. Well, then something happens. We get interrupted. We get distracted. We quiet ourselves down. We meditate. We sleep. We have a drink. Whatever it is, but something... That's that, and boom, pops out. Consciousness pops out a little wider. And now we begin to see more about what's going on. And not only are we open now to more inspiration, more fresh thinking, more new ideas from mind, but also we've got even more perspective on the brain and its creative function. It's not just subjective, it's constructed. That it's actually projected, what we're seeing, as much as it is received from the data that's coming in outside us. And now we've got even more freedom of movement. And now we're more open to just-in-time wisdom and to this deeper truth. And then something happens. We see more about this. We see it in someone else, and it triggers something in us. We have a thought come in from mind, and boom, it goes out even bigger. And now we have an experience of living from mind, where our state of mind, there's so much mind in our state that we're literally just in a direct flow. And that state is a state that all athletes are chasing. I was reading an interesting research project on extreme athletes, the guys who jump off cliffs and do all this crazy stuff, the X Games type people. And it was consistent in the interviews. They are all chasing that state of mind, that place where there's only the thinking. One guy who was a mountain climber, a free climber, was talking about it as like the voice. That when he's climbing, the voice tells him where to put his hands. And it's just this state of direct connection to that deeper mind, to that deeper wisdom. And when somebody gets a sense that this is how the mind works, not your mind, the mind. This is just how it works. That leads to what for me is the fourth don't think those ones. Let's try this one. A living moment-by-moment relationship with the wisdom within. Again, that's just how I think about it. So I start to have a relationship with mind now. I start to learn to rely on it. You know, there's a quote I read yesterday. I think it was a story told by Anthony de Mello. Any of you have heard of Anthony de Mello? He was a Jesuit priest. He poked a few too many bears. He's not with us anymore. But he talked about, you know, that a lot of us spend our time sitting by the river selling river water. Right? That we sell our good ideas. Right? We sell our inspirations. We sell our insights. Well, we have an opportunity to show people the river. That's what's different about this. Because when you show people the river, when you help them have a living moment-by-moment relationship with the wisdom within, well, then they can take it from there. Now, that doesn't mean you don't help, right? Because one of the functions that we have, as I mentioned, as facilitators, this one, is that we can facilitate problem solving and possibilities. So when we have an understanding of how the mind works, well, we know that we're probably going to do better solving the problem when the group comes together, right? And when they settle down. So that may be, however we've learned to do that, anyone who's any good at doing this with groups does that. You have ways of doing that. It might be exercises that you run. It might be mixers. It might be a timing of the way you lay out your day. It might be the environment you set your groups up in. But you know that if they're going to get anywhere, they're going to need to settle down. Because you have at least that much understanding of how mind works, how the mind works. And so you do that, and then into that space, you drop either big rocks or small rocks, depending on how settled the pond is. So if the group's pretty settled, it doesn't take much. You can just drop in a suggestion and they'll start to take it from there. If the group's still pretty unsettled, you've got to do bigger things, right? Because like in a pond, it's like you've got to drop a big rock if you're going to make ripples on a noisy pond. But on a quiet pond, you can drop in a pebble and the ripples will go all the way to the edge. Well, so intuitively good facilitators know this. And they do it. Again, this is the value of understanding the equipment. If you start to see, oh, that's how everybody's mind works, well, then you can work with that instead of sometimes luckily working with it or intuitively working with it without really knowing why it works. And then you might have made up stuff and add in bits. You know, there's a lot of versions of this story. It's just a kind of a classic teaching story, but the one that I like that I read recently is of a Zen master whose discourses were continually being interrupted by the monastery's cat. And so somebody came up with the great idea to tie the cat up in the corner during Zen discourses. Well, at some point, that cat died, and they started tying up the next cat. And at some point, the Zen master died, and new Zen masters came along, and a liturgy was written on the importance of tying up cats before discourse. Right? If we don't know what's going on, we make something up. And that's the value of pointing in this direction. And then you've got something really cool, because you've now got a group who not only is in that deeper state of mind, that quieter state of mind, in a better relationship with that, more connected to that innate wisdom. But if I'm in a living relationship with that, if I really have that, if as a group we all have that understanding, that shared understanding, it's amazing what we can do from that space. There's a book written about the principles many years ago called We've Got to Start Meeting Like This. And it was just literally a layout of the difference in meetings when this happens. We got to see it. There was a few of us were in Denmark doing a corporate retreat, working with 3 leaders from the team. And in the space of 90 minutes, they had a meeting where they got more resolved and moved forward than they would normally get in 3 months of meetings, because they started to see what was going on. That's the power of this. That's the impact of this. That's the practical, bottom line, business objective relevance of this conversation. It also feels better, is more fun, and you tend to, not always, but you tend to not feel drained, overwhelmed, and exhausted when you're done. Because you never got worked up in the first place. Because it's not that kind of gig. That doesn't mean it has to be low energy at all. But it's quieter underneath. I used the analogy once when I started to really feel this for myself, because I started to notice, because I'm a little bouncy, to put it politely. This is how people put it. And I noticed that I haven't stopped being bouncy. I haven't become old Zen. Right? I think I was a little concerned when I was first learning this that, I would have to take a quaalude before coming up in front of the group, and I would have to sit very quietly with everyone and discourse, things like that. It hasn't worked out that way at all, which I'm kind of glad about. But my internal feeling is so quiet compared to what it used to be. And it's the metaphor that came to me once. I was talking in a church in Alternatives in London, and I was doing a talk, and I was all over the shop. It was one of these big groups. I was, doing all that. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm an upside down duck. Right? The duck, calm on the surface, paddling like hell underneath? Well, I was like paddling like hell on the surface, but I was completely calm underneath. And that's what's on offer. Again, not every time, not every minute, because I still live in thought, which means icebergs pop up and I run into them. But they're not real icebergs, so they don't rip my ship to shreds. I don't even have a ship. So I want to do I have time? Yeah, I want to get you guys into a little bit of conversation about this, and then bring you back and have a little bit of a chat. So what I'd like you to do is, I would like you to kind of, let's go for this bit. I'd like you to get together with somebody that you know less well in the group, and I'd like you to share an experience you had that you think is this, if you're not sure what this is. An experience of something deeper coming through you. It might be an experience where you performed way beyond your capacity, as you understood your capacity to be. It might be an experience where it was going crazy around you and you were somehow calmer than you'd ever been. It might be an experience of just being somewhere and dropping into a deeper space, and it might have been the first time where you suddenly started contemplating God or the divine or spirit or something more than you in the world. And just take we'll take maybe 5 minutes each way, and then we'll come back, we'll see where that's gotten us to, and then we're going to take our lunch break. So I'd love to hear if anyone had a particular story that just is a nice one for share. Anything that you noticed in looking in that direction and having a conversation about it, and any questions that have come up from that as well. So over to you. And if you raise your hand, a microphone will magically appear in your hand. Great.
I think the thing that made a difference for me is in talking about it, you begin to realise how often you do it anyway. And that's lovely, because it just means that instead of seeking for something, you're discovering that that's what's inside anyway, which is effectively what you said.
Yeah, it's one of the distinctions that I found really useful about the difference between having this conversation in a more coachy context, business context, to in a more therapeutic context, is the dots are already usually there for people who've been reasonably successful in their lives, but this connects the dots. Sometimes when you're working for somebody who's really struggled up to this point in their life, you're kind of helping them create some dots. So that's a great example of that. Thank you. Justin.
Thank you. Get it, love it, groping my way towards it. And what's the difference between what you've just shared there, which I've done and experienced as a one-to-one thing, and doing that with a group? Is it the same thing, or is there something?
There's usually more people in the group.
Okay. You just have the same conversation.
Yeah, and it depends. So like I was explaining, and again, it's not that I would necessarily hide this, but it just probably wouldn't occur to me to bring up. So I was feeling bad because Kim's been excited about this and she's put it together and she's done an amazing job, and I've been on the road. So I haven't had any time to think about it, and she's had a lot of time to think about it. And so I came in last night thinking, even though what I would normally do is sit with it a bit before I go to bed the night before and sit with it a bit this morning before coming in, I tried to do it early so that I could talk to her about it so she wouldn't be bored. Like there'd be more of a sense of that. And then this morning, I kind of got up, didn't have much of a sense of how I was wanting to talk about it. Worked out. Some stuff began to burble through. And then I was 20 minutes late coming to meet Kim because I got back to the room and it just downloaded the first bit of the conversation. It was just like, oh yeah, this would be, and played with it, sat with it for a bit, and that was the first thing that we talked about, which was these 4 categories. Right? I've never talked about them like that before. I've never thought about them that way before. That's what occurred. Last night, what I did with Kim is I tried to learn as much as I could about you guys, because I knew that would inform what downloaded, was the more of a sense of who you were I had. If I hadn't had a chance to do that, I would have taken more time with you up front to hear from you specifically. I probably would have forced my way around the room and made everybody share something, just so that I had a sense of relevance of the conversation. So what's different is when the more people, the more you have to adapt to that. Like the larger group, when you take away, this is the edge of a group. I actually have done it go around the entire room in a group of 60 people. And that actually worked surprisingly well. I didn't know that it would. But there's a line somewhere for me where I probably wouldn't even think to try that. And then something else would occur to me, because that's how the mind works. And that, one of my favorite things about this understanding for me personally is I kind of know what to do when I don't know what to do. Yeah. And that has been incredibly helpful to me. Cool. Microphone over to Mo.
Thank you. That actually very closely resonates with the conversation that we've just had as to how much of this is coming from mind and how much of this is already in our unconscious that we've just forgotten. And it takes me back to when I first started learning about learning. Yeah. And I had that, I don't know anything, I don't know what's this stuff and NLP, never heard of any of it. I wonder if I'd met this understanding then, if it would have had the effect that it has. So how much of it is coming through you and how much of it is already there?
Yeah. I have no idea. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Ian.
The experience I unpacked was way back, 15, 20 years ago. And it's the first time, looking back now, I was consciously aware of having this type of experience and having kind of almost like seen my thinking for what it is. I didn't realize it at the time. And it just made me realize how we all have those experiences, but in fact, if you don't see it or recognize it for what it was, I just had no clue at the time. It was just a great feeling, and I walked away.
Yeah.
And I could see a whole bunch of things that changed as a result looking back, but it's only from the other end of it.
It's one of my favorite Winston Churchill quotes, that most men in life stumble across the truth once or twice and then get up, dust themselves off, and carry on as if nothing happened. And it's innocent, you know. It's like we chalk it up to, oh, that was great. Or we make something extraordinary up. And what we don't see is, because we spend so much time, this is what I think, we spend so much time in our thinking that it seems a rare occurrence until we're looking. And like Trish said, we start to say, oh, it's not a rare occurrence at all. And as we see the ordinariness of it, there's less of a need to make up a story around it. And that's the beauty. Now, I want to check in with you guys. Can you feel that it is much quieter in here now than it was an hour ago? There's the same amount of talking. That's the warmer. You know, warmer, colder? That's warmer. That's one of the ways you navigate a room, is you start to get a feel. And again, you don't know what I'm talking about, do 50 groups. But paying attention to that. And you'll start to see, oh, that's warmer. I used to think that was colder. This started happening when I started talking about this, and I thought my groups were broken. I thought I had lost rapport because people weren't jumping up, and there was like a minute sometimes between questions. I started filling in all the gaps. I started desperately tap dancing and vamping to try and keep them entertained because I'm losing them. And what I didn't know is that what I thought was losing them was what a steady, calm heartbeat looks like, not a flat line. And so that becomes, as we train and teach and lead, it's really useful to begin to get really a real feel for warmer and a real feel for colder. And colder gets very up here, gets very heady. There's not a lot of insight in the conversation. You can almost hear people hit play on the tape recorder and play back things they've said 1,000 times before. That's colder. And again, the more you can have a feel for warmer and colder, the easier it is to navigate any room, regardless of what the task at hand might be.